Welcome back to the Street Photography Magazine podcast. I'm Bob Patterson, founder of Street Photography Magazine, and our newly minted, what are we? Very newly minted? Not so new, not so
I'd say new
minted, but
still.
yeah, Ashley Refo is now the publisher of the magazine. So she's now my boss. The tables have been turned. She's pretty mean too, I gotta say.
It's hard to keep Bob in line.
Yeah, well,
Now I have to be the bad cop.
that's right. That's right. And our guest today is Bethany Jacobson, and she was recommended to us by our friend Michael Rababi. And you guys met up in, did you meet in Paris?
Yes,
Is
we
that
met
Paris? Okay.
Harry Potter.
Okay. Went to Perry photo. Yes, you say it right. Paris photo from us Midwesterners. Anywho, so welcome, Bethany.
Nice to be here.
Bethany's in New York. She's a photographer, she's a filmmaker, educator, and she started shooting in the 80s back before Ashley was born.
I was born
So
in the 80s, okay?
I know you were, but she started before that. I've seen her work. Yeah, she's done a lot of really cool stuff. We'll just let her tell her own story. So Bethany, give us your backstory in
Okay.
5 minutes or less.
Okay, my backstory. Well, I grew up on the Upper West Side of New York in a fairly educated, artistic Jewish family. I was exposed to art from a pretty young age, and I was always literally from like 10 or 11. I found something that I was in love with, which was the visual arts. So I used to go to art classes from an early age, take the bus down Columbus or Amsterdam to MoMA and took art
Hmm.
classes after school, and eventually went to the High School of Music and Art. And then
Oh.
in my teens, I moved to Europe and I continued to study art, not filmmaking or photography. That came a little later. But around the age of 16, my dad gave me an old Leica, which I still have sitting not far from me, a World War II, I think it was from this camera, and it's one of the ones that loads from the bottom. So it's not the easiest camera to use or
Mm.
to focus with a reflex camera. And that was my first exposure to film photography. And then I started, I guess I was at a camp or something where I got to use a dark room. And then jumping ahead some years later, I progressed in my is to using a Nikon and learning. I did not go to school for photography. I went to Cooper Union actually for painting. Then eventually somehow found my way into, I was always doing multimedia. And then I started doing photography because not only did I love it, and I always followed different photographers, but I married somebody who was a journalist and we started to collaborate on journalistic stories that he pitched. This was in the 1980s. He was British and he was better at me at hustling in that sense of pitching stories to editors. And it was a very different time now. Print magazines was a much bigger arena for photographers. And I didn't really think of it per se at the time as a career. I just loved doing it. And he managed to get us some stories. That's kind of how I got into photography, a very compressed version of my life in photography. And I've gone, I would say, in and out of it because I've also worked as a filmmaker for more than 20 years. I did video installations back in the 80s, and I returned to photography more seriously, I would say, in the last 10 years as I've gotten older. And also discovered that filmmaking is very frustrating because it's quite expensive. And I got frustrated with the feature project I had worked on for many years. And when the financing didn't happen, I just said I had had enough of that. And I focused on photography again in more full-time way.
Yeah, that's a pretty tough business.
It is. But, I've made a few films. I've worked on films. So I would say also that cinematic viewpoint, I guess, in terms of how stories are told, also somewhat influences my aesthetic, I would say. Not completely, but partially. And also just the use of materials also has influence because, the work that you and I connected on is about the 1980s. But before that, I was doing a project about the cemetery across the street from where I live. And that project is a completely different style, and approach.
Yeah, so that's your next book, Another Time, Another Place. And, so your new book is, I guess, really to preserve and contextualize, a moment that's largely been mythologized, at least in our area. And, so what do you think gets the most misunderstood about the era of the '80s in the downtown scene? And what do you want people to actually understand about it? And then how's your book gonna deliver on that?
Well, for me, I don't know what's misunderstood about it. I know it's been hyped. I would say that, certain personalities, I guess, came out of that. Pop art led to street art, and graffiti art and hip hop all kind of converged at the same time as when real estate was cheap. There were several different movements, so to speak, or communities that kind of converged. So uptown, meaning like the South Bronx, which was doing a lot of the tagging on the trains, came downtown, and people like Patty Astor, I'm trying to think of the other gallerists, they embraced them. And so there was an opening because they had not been legitimized. Even then, they were certainly not taken seriously. The only one that maybe had any kind of reputation or that grew in that time was Jean-Michel Basquiat. But people like Futura, he was beginning to, Rammellzee, and many others. So there was a place that Stefan Eins ran in the South Bronx, he was a German guy. He must be 80 now, and it'll come to me in a minute. But it was a storefront that a lot of the graffiti writers came to. And then Charlie Ahern, I don't know if you know who he is. He's a filmmaker who made Wild Style, and he's got a twin brother who's a sculptor. So they also were very big in that scene. And then you had people like Blondie, they were doing music also. It wasn't just visual arts. People would go into the studio. So like Futura collaborated with The Clash. There was a lot of, what did you say, crossover, I guess is the right word, and energy that was created. And, and then there were some like Richard Hambleton, who was a white guy. He used to do these shadow man things on corners. So the street became, and then of course there was Basquiat doing Samo. At that time, people were rebelling against the gallery system also. You have to remember what was in style at that time. We were coming out of minimalism, and I certainly I was not into Dan Flavin, and, those were the people who were, and performance art was big at the time too. And then there were a lot of alternative space nonprofits, which also kind of, I think, fed into some of this, meaning you could go to Millennium or you could go to Film Video Arts, and you could do things on the cheap, so experimental video photography, performance, all of it kind of it was a big mishmash. And everybody who lived below 14th Street kind of was easy. It was just not a huge community. It wasn't like today. It was a very different reality. So you could meet people in clubs. That was the other factor. There were many more clubs, and art were kind of intersecting. So the club area, which I photographed, the Good Brothers made these thematic shows, basically, and Danceteria, run by Rudolph, who was a German Brazilian guy. I had a show. I don't know if this is where we should be going, but anyway, I just went to him with my portfolio. He used to have a space called Congo Bill, and I dressed up in my best pedal pushers with polka dots and platform shoes. Portfolio. And I don't know. I don't even know. I say phoned him up, pre-cell phones, right?
Yeah.
Found his number, in the phone book.
Oh, and I used to go there and dance, and made an appointment and showed him my work. And he said, okay, fine. You have a show in Congo Bill for 3 days. You take care of it. And then I put together, it was a do-it-yourself thing. I found a sound artist, and I made my own invitation. And I had a friend who made C prints, and he printed like, I don't know, that wasn't cheap even then, 25 prints. And a lot of people came, but I was too scared, so I came late to my own opening. Um, you know, I always had a somewhat ambivalent relationship to success or whatever success stands for. So, anyway, what my point in telling that anecdote is that it was a very eclectic, sort of porous situation. And so, you could move with fluidity through that in a different way than now it's much more hierarchical in my view, even though more opportunities exist, more artists exist. In a way, having a smaller community was kind of easier in a sense to navigate and to make connections with other artists. So my photography practice comes out of that. I think the spirit of that. And I know I'm on a street photography podcast, but I'm not a
That's
pure street photographer, if there is such a
nobody is. Well,
okay.
maybe there's some.
And so
Yeah.
just to get that off my chest.
No,
Okay.
That sounds
that's
like the way you describe that era, it sounds kind of like a transformational era for art.
yeah.
And I mean, did you see it? Did you think that it was that at the time? Or was that just looking back? You're like, wow, that was an interesting
No,
shift.
it was I would say the most exciting time in my life. No, I wasn't aware of it. I was very, very fortunate. I always had a kind of what's the word? Fearless ness to me. I mean, I took over a huge loft space in 1978 that ran from Chambers Street to Reed Street, literally 4,000 square feet. That
Wow.
was advertised. There were 2 floors, and I think the rent was $500.
Wow.
It was a municipal space, so it was all kind of this weird green color. It was right down the street from City Hall. And I split the loft in half and I rented out half of it. And I lived there from 78 to 93.
Long time.
Lived in another loft from 75 to 78 over by the river more. Tribeca back then wasn't Tribeca.
Yeah.
Now that building is, I don't know, probably $20 million. Back then we wouldn't think of it. We used to throw the keys out the window 5 flights up so we could get them in a sock.
You know,
Yes, you're right. It's only now that I'm much older that I'm reflected back. I never thought to this is the great work of my life, so to speak. But then when I started to go through my archive, which I think a lot of artists who start to get up there in years start to look at their work and see, to evaluate it, so to speak. And I realized, well, there are some things here that are worth sharing. I'm also the parent of a 28-year-old that thinking about the next subsequent generations that they might not have this view, and everybody photographs it differently. A lot of people photographed in black and white, like Godless. I don't know if you know him. He did the whole book about CBGB's street photographer. He shot
yes.
with a Leica outside, and it had a very particular look at night. And there are other photographers, like the Soho News was a big magazine because if you think about street photography, it was also about what are you going to do with these photos. We didn't just shoot to keep them in our folder or whatever. And it's different also to shoot film because you actually have to go and get a process, and you have to bring it to a lab. And I was shooting transparencies because that's what magazines used. And that's a very specific thing that's different than shooting negative because if you don't really nail the exposure relatively, you don't have something
Yeah.
sellable,
Hmm.
you know. So that's one thing that's interesting as I look back to that work. I wish I'd shot more actually,
So you said you went back through your archives, which is not real easy since it was all film and depending on how organized you are, I guess. But what was the impetus to do that? Did you have a revelation one day saying, I better see what this is all about? And
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
what did you learn or what did you discover that you didn't even know you had?
Well, so a few of the images that are of the more famous people, like
Hmm.
Jacques Basquiat, that was behind me, an area club. People, I must have had it in something because it wasn't published. And then now museums and other institutions, like there's a show going on right now at the Louisiana Museum in outside Copenhagen. So, for instance, they just licensed my image, and it's been licensed before. So a couple of my images have found their way into books, like about Ram LZ last year, that was published by Rizzoli. And I think around that time, I had finished my Ode to a Cemetery book, which was a 2-year or more project, 3 years maybe. And I always loved photography books forever. And that whole world of photography books has been a journey in itself, discovering how they've changed, the whole production process, etc. So I think I decided, okay, I'm going to look back because I think maybe there's a book that I want to make and a narrative that I could loosely put together about that time. So it wasn't like I shot in a channel, meaning I didn't shoot all rock and roll or whatever. My subject matter wasn't one thing. It's more I realized that what I think I have is a more poetic, lyrical, sort of loose narrative because I shot as I looked back at the work and I'm sort of discovering what my own approach was. What did I focus on? What's my aesthetic? I see that the things that stand out to me are one, the landscape. How did the landscape and spaces, how did they inform the city? I didn't want to do a book like, here's what it was like then, here's what it's like. Yeah.
Mhm.
You
That
can
would,
find that on Facebook.
that would be very depressing, actually. Yes, it would be. Here's an abandoned pier, and now here's little island that looks very pretty, but it's touristic, and that's who goes there.
Yeah.
Because the city was New York, and I grew up here, was a manufacturing base. And in the 70s, it was going through a huge change. The city was bankrupt. There was a garbage strike. The administration wasn't handling things too well, and it was gritty and somewhat dangerous even, and I think that kind of, what would you say, forlorn? That's the lack of a better, forlorn versus the kind of vibrancy of street art, the kind of energy that graffiti and putting things on abandoned walls, that is interesting to me. And then, of course, some of the personalities, because I happened to be there and I filmed them. And so I've always liked portrait photography. So I'd say it's an intertwining of those two things.
Yeah, looking back at your archives, one of the photos that jumped out at me was the photo of Iggy Pop in front of the Twin Towers.
Mm.
And, that I think in hindsight, that photo carries a lot of weight based on what happened. And
Yeah, exactly.
I don't even know if you remember taking that photograph,
I
but
do.
but what were you trying to capture at the time, and how do you feel about that now, knowing what we know happened to those buildings and the people who were in it?
Well, I think it's an iconic photograph for the reason you mentioned, and also because of how Iggy Pop posed, and because he's standing there like Jesus Christ, and with this 2x4 against something that was obviously a huge tragedy, and still is controversial as to how did it occur, and represented symbol of power. So I don't know if Iggy Pop or Jim Osterberg, as he introduced himself to me, he was, the godfather of punk. And I guess I sort of considered myself a punk, though I wasn't like deep into it. I was sort of on the outskirts.
I was kind of curious about that, Bethany. Like, how did you fit into this whole scene?
Yeah.
That's an interesting question. A friend of mine said, "Oh, well, you were part of it." And I said, "Well, no, I don't think of she was convincing me because I was talking about doing the book. And I said, I always felt more of as an outsider. I never had a plan. Oh, I'm going to be like Annie Leibovitz, the great photojournalist. And in fact, I didn't, because I would move from one medium to another. Like while I was doing photojournalism, I was also doing a 3-channel video installation at PS1, which was actually much more time consuming than doing photojournalism. So I think, to answer your question in a very long roundabout way, I think that I always did have a sensibility of radicalism, I guess is a better way to put it, counterculture. But I didn't want to be, I prefer to be in the outsider looking at something, because I feel that detachment in a way gives me a better, I think even the way that I frame is that way. I've been thinking about that myself. Like, if you look at a William Klein photograph, the way the lens choice, the angle, he steps over the boundary line of, in your face.
Yeah.
I'm a more, at least at that time, I was more like, I'm more formal in some ways, more observing its situation. The shot with Iggy Pop is very special, I think, because I didn't know him really. I'd seen him perform. It was a job. I was working for a magazine called Blitz, and it was
Huh.
an album that he had just put out called Blah, Blah, Blah. He came with his publicist, and that was it. And then he climbed up the 5 flights of stairs. I happened to have this view. We started out shooting sort of more traditional portraits, and then that wasn't quite exciting. And then he went downstairs, I guess, and grabbed a 2x4 and came back up, because the stairs were right in my loft and went directly, they weren't outside. So it was kind of special, that. And then he jumped up on the divider between the 2 buildings and just started playing around. And the shot they actually used in the magazine, in my view, wasn't the strongest shot. They didn't use the shot that you like where he's like that. They used one where he's sort of slumping. And I don't know why, but that was the way it went. So, and then they used another shot where he's on this, I was in an old turn of the century building with a ledge at the front, this canyon of buildings with the Woolworth building and the Twin Towers. It's a very cinematic landscape. So I don't know. I said, would you mind lying on the edge of the building over there? And he said yes. And I didn't give it, I just went for it, and I started wide. And then eventually I went closer, closer. And because the light was from above and he was lean, that way, the last shot is a close up. It hasn't been published. It may be there, where it got rid of all the wrinkles, it got rid of all the wear, because I'm pretty sure at the time he might have been doing drugs, but I could be wrong.
No, that's probably not possible.
But anyway, and he has fantastic blue eyes, very piercing blue eyes. And then I was able to get that close, that was like we built trust. And it was a very organic experience for me. I was sort of like, he's very balletic, like David Bowie is, very physically, loose person and, performer. So, and I always love dance too. So I think for me, being a photographer, especially of portraits, is figuring out where am I physically in relationship to the person. And it's very intuitive. It's not about, oh, stand there, look at, occasionally I'll say like lower your chin or some very small thing. But I feel like it's like you're in this weird mental space with the other person, and you don't have a lot of time. I took those shots like boom, boom, boom. It's not like the person is gonna stay there forever.
Yeah.
Or you're in a studio where there was not even a bounce light there. I had no assistant, nothing. It's just me and and Iggy Pop. That was really, and of course I didn't even know what I shot till I got it back. You have to remind yourself, now we live in the digital age, you can pre-visualize everything.
Mm-hmm.
You're looking through and it's boom, 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 and you don't know exactly what the frame is till you get the film back. So that was exciting to do that kind of thing for me.
Yeah. What time of day was it? Must have been.
It was a great day because it was sort of in the late afternoon, I think.
Okay. All right.
And it was sort of
So I
flat
thought,
lighting. It was good because otherwise, if it had been high noon, it would have been terrible,
yeah.
contrast. So I was lucky.
In that era, that was, well, it wasn't like the late 60s or anything, but, it was like the middle of the AIDS crisis and the Reagan,
Reagan.
the Reagan area of politics. And, it was kind of a climate of adversity, I guess.
Mhm.
And it seems like it kind of reminds me of today in a number of ways. And
Except,
uh,
yeah, it does
it,
and doesn't, I think.
it's yeah. I mean, the era of Reagan. You look back on it, it seems like like puppies and
It's quaint.
flowers and things compared to what's going on now. But being able to look back on that era, what advice would you have to people today who are working in in photography or film, and
In what sense?
how to approach it, and or because it was not a fun time back then,
No,
especially
but in some
the
ways, if
age.
you had access, I suppose because I didn't think about this person is well known or this, I wasn't intimidated, generally
Hmm.
speaking. I mean, and I do think there's a difference between journalistic photography and more formal type of photography, if you may call
Hmm.
it that. Like I never went into advertising or that kind of, that would have been the way to go if you wanted to make money. You don't make money as a photojournalist, generally speaking.
No.
I think back then you would get, my biggest spread was for House and Garden was the PepsiCo Gardens, and that was like 10 pages. It took like 2 years for it to finally get published. And
Wow.
I think it was $250 a page or something plus expenses. I don't think it's changed that much, oddly enough, because now we don't have print magazines. We only have, online. But I mean, are we talking aesthetically, artistically, or in terms of
just
career? These are
just
so many different factors.
career, or
Mm.
just being an artist, I think.
I think there's a lot more opportunities just in general. I mean, I'm still exploring them. I'm still struggling as an artist. I made my living primarily for the last 25 years as a college educator in film departments. And I worked in film and television to some extent, doing whatever, NTV stuff. But I think one thing, when I read like about artists these days, it's not a big deal to be a multimedia artist anymore. It's
Hmm.
pretty common. And art galleries have changed too. Like in New York, there are only a few purely photographic photo galleries anymore. They can't afford brick and mortar. And also the whole photography scene, quote unquote, has changed. So photography has been subsumed into fine arts in a different way, in my view. I mean, I'm talking outside of, photojournalism, so these boundaries, I guess you'd say, or categories, there are more categories, and there's more grants, there are more online magazines, there's more podcasts, there's more people creating work.
Yeah.
So I think on that level, it's a great opportunity, a great time. The fiscal reality is a different story. I mean, I think most people have to have a job, and they have to find, and I'm talking about people even my age. Many people, unless they retired and they went to it as late in life, they made money doing something else. Many,
Yep.
many people, they were lawyers or business people, or, to have a career as an artist, which somehow is mostly people that teach, it's the majority that I'm in contact with. So
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah,
know if
that's a
I,
good
that's
point.
right.
I feel like we see that in this area of street photography as well. People who seem to do really well and, this is their livelihood and that's all they do mostly are people who teach.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're in different departments, and even teaching is pretty competitive. I mean, I've taught for 25 years, and I've taught in film. So it's sort of, I don't know, it's not ironic. It's just in the last 10 years, I wanted to segue into maybe teaching and photography departments, but it's really not that easy. You can't just jump because your background is different. I am where I am, so to speak.
yeah. So where do you
Yeah.
teach? Where are you teaching
The
now?
last place I was teaching, I was at Brooklyn College
Mm.
and teaching film production courses, and then not there anymore. I was teaching at the Borough of Manhattan Community College. I was teaching actually screenwriting, and before that, I've taught at Pratt Institute, many places.
Well,
I have a question for you as a filmmaker. You have your short film that came out in 2016, which is
Mm-hmm.
like 25 minutes, right? And so you packed in that small amount of time. I feel like a lot of filmmaking is probably the editing process. I don't know, I'm not in that world, but
Hmm.
I feel like editing is so important, and you've packed a big story into a small amount of time. And photography sometimes mirrors that, in that lots of people want to tell a story with one frame. So how do you look at like your editing process? I'm sure it's way different from making a film versus making a photo, but what insights do you think are helpful for people who are either just trying to capture a story in a frame, or maybe trying to capture a good, meaningful story in a series of photos?
Well, I think something I learned from my book project, Ode to a Cemetery, which was a very specific situation because I'm photographing, it's basically landscape and statuary. So they're inanimate objects, so
Mhm.
to speak, and you're limited by certain factors just physically. So when I put that book together, and I'd shot over a long time, and there were different styles, and I don't know if you know who Douglas Stockdale is. He runs Photo Book Journal. He was a mentor to me during my book, Ode to a Cemetery. I took a workshop with him about how to make photo books. And so what I realized in that, number one, was he said, well, you have too many different styles. You have photojournalism and you have lyrical approach and so on. So figure out which way you want it, which direction, it has to be consistent. And then the second part that I realized somewhat on my own was that every frame did not have to always tell a complete story, that
Mhm.
there are transitional images that could be going from more of a storytelling frame, so to speak, to you need those too. I mean, it depends kind of what era you're in almost. Like if I have many different references, but like if you look at Eugene Auger, the French
Mhm.
photographer,
Mhm.
he loved to photograph street windows, in Paris, right? And he used a large format camera, and certain things are defined by the technology that you use. So you have to go a certain distance, the film, all those things. And the way that he shot them, he never shot, or very rarely ever, anything straight on.
Mhm.
So, I don't think he stood around maybe thinking, well, I'm going to line the camera up, but he was conscious somewhere along the line that this is the way. If you look at an Auger photograph, I immediately know it's his because I know the way that his aesthetic, the way he frames. When I made my book, it is answering a question. So after a while, you begin to know your own aesthetic. Like,
Mm.
okay, this is how I shoot. This is the distance to the subject. This is I'm composing with, foreground, middle, whatever, or I'm not. I'm more composing flat. All those, how do I use depth of field? How do I use color, etc. And as you become more conscious of your own choices, I think that's what is editing. And becoming an editor, in my view, and coming from a film background, absolutely is essential to me, at least in my process, to becoming a better photographer. And to
Mm.
also understanding, like, if I'm going to put a book together, that how are these images how do they flow? And they can flow for different reasons. And also, when you
Mhm.
get into then further, even more deeper into the graphic design element of it, it's not like we're in the era of Robert Frank where every photograph is plunked in the middle of the page, turn the white page opposite. That was the old days of how people designed a book, and nothing wrong with it. It was fine.
Mhm.
But people have different expectations now. And if you look at book design, sometimes it's over designed, in my view, but there's too much. It's like the
Mhm.
design is taken over the images. So it's a kind of many people who edit their own work, they print a lot of the work out in small images. And then they lay them out on a table or a wall, and then they, shuffle them around. Some people, jump right into InDesign and do it that way. Personally do think I print them out like small, not even the same size as the page. And then it takes time because you start to see the ones that are good, and at least in your own view, these are
Mm.
stronger than others. But it also, an interesting thing's happened, or I'm learning. For instance, I had a meeting with a graphic designer and I showed her my edit. So let's say it was 80 images. And she said, well, like, we need 200. This
After all that.
yeah, and so she said, we want the B, C ones. You know, we want ones that you weren't as that you didn't think were as good, but we cut them out, that you cut them
Mhm.
out. Because you don't realize sometimes when you're designing a book that those things might be really interesting. You didn't see
Mm.
something that
Yeah.
we saw. And that was actually eye-opening for me. And that's why, like, when people say, well, you could, I even have done graphic design in my life. Somebody said, why don't you just do it yourself, save yourself a lot of money? And I'm like, well, no, I do like to sequence, but then I want to give it to somebody else because they're going to have a very different viewpoint. And I
Mm.
need that fresh set of eyes because they'll create connections that maybe I never could have
Yeah.
seen.
When you're
So,
that close to it, it's hard to see
Yeah.
sometimes. Yeah.
yeah.
You
It's
know,
interesting that you said the cemetery stuff, someone told you that it was kind of all over the place and that you needed to get it down. So it sounds like when you started out, maybe you hadn't quite settled on a certain aesthetic or style. And did that kind of come out over time?
Yeah.
Or like, how do you determine, oh, this is my style, this is my aesthetic?
I think just by going over it and over it, and then as you're designing a book, then you realize, well, I actually need, I went back actually, and I saw that I was missing. I could see, oh, I don't have enough of that time or that mood or that even like, oh, I need more wide shots or, it's
Mm.
some
Mm-hmm.
of it is just a book is not the same as an exhibit. An exhibit is
Mm-hmm.
more like every image sort of has to stand on its own, generally, unless you're working with series again, that's a different thing. But in a book, you do need to have a flow of a variety.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I did that was kind of crazy is I ended up going in a very different direction, which was doing image transfers. I don't know if you saw that
Oh,
on my website.
yeah.
Started to do image transfers, and there's one right over there,
Oh,
which,
nice.
yeah, and this is on handmade paper that I made.
yeah,
And
I saw
that
that.
I did a whole series as I was doing traditional photography. And Doug, who was advising me, was like, and I was working with a poet, Cole Svensson. She's quite well known. She wrote the text that accompanies the images. And I'd already kind of had the book at a certain place, but then I had done all this work that year. And I was like, why am I not putting this in the book? And I was like, I don't think it belongs. And I said, well, I'm doing it.
I've got a question. When you're editing your book and you're going through all these photos, you made the prints and everything, do you ever get to the point where you're just tired of looking at it and you say, I don't want to look at this stuff anymore? Do you ever
Yes.
get to that point?
Absolutely, and there are points where I'm like, "I hate all these photographs."
Good. How do you deal with that?
Well,
Do you
I'm
just walk
bored by
away?
it, like, I've seen them and so what?
Yeah.
It's like, why are they interesting?
Yeah.
And what is a good photograph? That's another thing, like, you get more and more, well, at least for me, I don't know you, but I become more harsh or not harsh, more critical,
Mhm.
self-critical, and if I was to continue to do that, I would just probably never do anything. I would just stop because there wouldn't be the perfect photograph, so
Yeah. Yeah.
think and you're never sort of being an artist is like you're always looking striving somehow,
Yeah.
is there a place like if you're a painter you say okay I'm done now, but then you can go back to an image uh and discover something that you didn't see initially, like if I put a photograph on my wall and I don't have that big of a wall space, it's because I think it's good enough. In fact, I think somebody asked me how are you doing and I said good enough.
Yeah. Or I
Good
like,
enough.
it's not just good, it's good enough.
It's
Well, that's the thing about doing art, right? Like you're saying,
never done.
there's not like a perfect that you're gonna reach and then say, "Okay, no more art. We did it." Like, that's not what it's
No.
about, right?
I mean, I look at a lot of art and I look at a lot of photography and that helps actually. Like if I
Mhm.
go and see a book, like when I went to Paris Photo, which was like going to photo heaven, so to speak. I'd never been to it. It was like, the film festival Cannes, which I had been to, but it was like going to the Palais, which is this enormous glass structure that goes for 3 blocks. And you walk in, and I was with my daughter on the opening night. She was like, "I want to get out of here. I don't like all these people. I can't take it." And I'm like,
Bye.
to me, it was like, "Oh, this is fantastic." So eventually I got rid of her. Not that night, but the next day. Because she, likes photography, but not the way I do. So, and that was like, mind blowing because you're discovering so many people that I didn't know about, both historical figures and new artists, and that inspires me anyway, to think about so many different approaches. I mean, photography is an amazing art form in my view. And nowadays people are doing so many different things with it, you know. So,
Who are a couple artists that you learned about in Paris Photo that you
well,
really
I
were inspired by?
rediscovered some. I mean, I always liked the Starn twins. I don't know if you know who they are. They're twins. They do sort of alternative processes, and they actually are doing kind of bent. It's hard to explain, but it's not laying flat anymore. Their structures are made out of curved wood, and they're then doing clouds. It's difficult to explain, but they look like constable paintings, but they're using photographic processes. And then there was another guy. Hold on one second. This
That's
guy, I
quite all
really
right.
love him,
Okay.
named Jeff Cowan. And he was showing, I think it's called Provence works. And his work is also alternative processes. I mean, these are huge. These are not
Wow.
small prints. They're not, they're done with traditional processes. And then he's integrating all different styles. I mean, look very simple in here, but when you see them like huge, so he was somebody I didn't know about before. And here's another one. And his works are like
Wow.
4 feet high. And this was just a little book I bought. I mean, I don't remember all the people I discovered because I didn't write all their names down.
We
But
had a few articles come in this year about different events. Paris Photo was one of them, and that's one thing that was kind of on everybody's radar is more like multimedia arts. So I know you were in heaven. It was just for you.
yeah, I think also like the photo gallery in London. What's the one I'm trying to think? It's the main photo gallery in the center of London. They also had a booth, and they had an African artist who had painted on the photographs on
Mhm.
black and white prints, like traditional, darker prints, but had painted with colorful paint. And so there's a lot of expression going on. And so I think sort of like different camps, between what I would say photographic mediums being used within the broader art world. And then,
Mhm.
sort of what's more pure photography, if that's the right word to use it, more journalistic photography, which is aimed more at magazines or other, venues, so to speak. So
You
I would.
know, oh, I'm sorry, you were saying something else? I
No, I'm
didn't
just
mean to
saying
interrupt.
I think I'm a little schizophrenic because on the one hand, my last project was using alternative processes and mixing it in with traditional landscape photography. Now I'm going back to my old work, and I'm also printing it up because I have my own Epson 24-inch printer because I want to exhibit some of the work and putting together a book project. So I tend to work project to project. That makes as opposed to I'm only in this lane
Yeah,
or
Mhm.
I'm only in that
I
lane.
get it. I get it.
That's
What
how I work.
I mean, you've been making work for like over 4 decades or so, and in multiple disciplines. And looking back, even though you've been doing different things, is there like a thread that runs through all of it? Something that you've always been after, regardless of the medium?
Hmm.
Is it?
I would say this will sound a little broad. I like sort of what's the word? Ethos, for lack of a better way to put
Yeah.
it. Sort of lyrical, poetic approach to
Mm-hmm.
images.
Hmm?
Even in the photojournalism that I have, I don't think I'm a pure photojournalist, actually, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
That makes
Yeah,
sense, having looked at your photos from
yeah.
from the
I
80s in New
think
York.
I've always had a painterly or whatever, I hate that word, whatever,
Well,
that
it's
way.
a
Is that what you studied though when you were younger?
yeah.
You were doing painting, right?
Yeah, painting, drawing from pretty young. So
Mm.
yeah, I studied until I got to, I think it was abstraction when I was at Cooper Union. And then I had a crisis of whatever, couldn't figure out what I was doing. Like, I didn't want to paint anymore. I wasn't alone. A lot of people were doing that. And then that's when I turned toward video art and toward, being a photographer. But I always loved photography. And I suppose another fact that maybe, or if there's a genre, is also certain people like Man Ray surrealism,
Mhm.
Mhm.
even though my photos are not directly surrealist at all. But there's something about the mysteriousness of that, what is not shown. Like I also like Japanese photographers, and there's one Japanese female photographer I very much like. So there's a certain level of abstraction, and I'm trying to
Mm.
remember Jung. I have to look her up, but it's strange, but I like a certain level of abstraction, not pure abstraction, like so you don't
Mm.
recognize it, and
Mhm.
also texture. Like, there's a filmmaker, Tarkovsky, who's a Russian filmmaker. One of the things he talked about a lot was texture. And the thing about a camera is generally, a camera is removed and it's the surface of the print or the reproduction. It is a reproduction, right? So
Mhm.
it's an approximation of the texture. It's how the light like hits an object. So that's another thing that I think I am drawn to now in this time, maybe as much when I was younger.
I know we didn't get a chance to talk about it much, but I really like that series on your website, the Dreamscapes, which
Oh,
are
yeah.
kind of like, abstract ideas in a
Yeah.
photo. I like that a lot. I liked those.
Well, thank you. Are those the one with just light in certain different situations or the
You have
one?
a lot of like mannequins and reflections and
That's another thing. I think why I like Auger a lot, reflections. I was thinking I would do another book because I'm constantly looking at storefront reflections,
Mhm.
and in the external and the internal external things that implied dreamscapes. You're right. Yeah. And that's also why I like surrealism, Man Ray, or somebody like, because there's an enigma in it. It doesn't say everything, it gives the audience space to figure
To
it out.
imagine.
Yeah, exactly. And I like the filmmaker Wim Wenders very much. He's an,
Mhm.
I relate
Yes.
how he shoots landscapes, and I even interviewed him back in the 80s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I did an article and photographs somewhere, maybe on my website. There's an image of him. So yeah, so
So what are you working on now?
working on raising the money for the book.
I'm talking about creatively.
Well, I'm working on the sequencing of, it's not all creative. I mean, well, creativity
Well,
is,
that's certainly
uh,
creative, yeah.
it,
Sometimes those practical breaks you have to take, like to raise money for something,
Oh, yeah.
means when you get to dive back into the creative endeavor, you're like refreshed and ready, I
yeah,
think.
absolutely. And I'm thinking about what I want to do next. And I have some ideas, but I never talk about those things aloud. I don't until I actually start on it because I don't know, I'm superstitious or something.
Gotcha. I understand.
You know?
We won't make you
Understand.
jinx it.
Yeah. I don't want to jinx it. So, yeah, I'm trying to I'm waiting to hear about a few things. Let's put it that way. So,
Okay.
Well,
I'm
keep
trying
us
to.
posted, Bethany. That's something that I very much like about you as a person is how you have such wide interests and you do not limit your art in any way. I really like that.
Thank
Yeah,
you. Thank you.
I agree.
Thank
I
you.
agree.
Appreciate that because sometimes I felt like it was a hindrance because
Mm.
at my age it's difficult because the world wants to categorize you.
That's what you hear all the time now, right? Like you have to niche down, like you have to do one
Yeah,
thing.
Well, if you want to be sellable, but I'm a punk, so I'm not going to be pigeonholed.
there you go. Well, before we go, why don't you tell us where people can learn more about you online and more about your progress on Another Time, Another Place?
Okay. Well, they should go to my website, bethanyjacobson.com, and in around that you always find what's going on with me, as well as I'm waiting to see about something that's happening in Amsterdam, but I don't know the final word, so I can't say, but it'll be on my website.
Okay.
I was a finalist for an exhibition there, and even if
Ooh.
I'm not one of the two that get selected, there will be an online exhibition, so to speak, and it's called the Elliott Gallery. There'll be information about that. In June, I'm going to have a 3-day pop-up show with images from the 1980s at a gallery. It's called Gallery 128 on Rivington Street. Then I'm relaunching my Kickstarter campaign, and please come to it. You'll find the link on my website where I will be, in a sense, pre-selling the book, which is going to be published by Damiani, which is in Italy, a publisher in Italy.
Yeah, and please share any of those links with us. We will put them in the show notes of the show. And
Well, thank you very
so you
much,
get the.
Bob and Ashley. This was really fun.
Well, thank you. Well, yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah,
And
likewise.
I've got to go back and thank Michael for introducing us.
Yes, Michael was a wonderful guy. I loved his casino book.
Yes, yes, me too. He did a wonderful job with it.
Anyway, thank you.